Now our introduction, number one. Of all the playwrights in this course, William Shakespeare needs the least introduction. He's covered everywhere. I assume he's still taught in grade school. He's universally acknowledged as the world's greatest playwright, and in a sense I think that is true, despite his philosophy. Here is a quick orienting introduction if you need it. He's 1564 to 1616. So that dates him about 2,000 years after Sophocles. We are now in the England of Queen Elizabeth I, at the very end of the Renaissance, which is usually dated 1450 to 1600. Othello was written in 1601 to 2, and it was first performed in 1604. It is classified as a mature tragedy for obvious reasons if you read it, mature because Shakespeare was at the height of his powers. Now there is a language problem with this which is different from Sophocles in that it is written in late Middle English. I strongly recommend and try to get for this course a book in the Contemporary Shakespeare series edited by A.L. Rowse, R-O-W-S-E, which has separate paperback editions for all the main works, and it's Shakespeare translated into English. It follows his line structure, his meter, his images, everything. It just substitutes intelligible words now and then for the Elizabethanisms that have lost their meaning to us. And you can read right through it with no difficulty, retaining 98% of Shakespeare's language and poetry, and none of the obscurity and difficulty of the Elizabethan text. Unfortunately, it was not in print anymore, so we're stuck with Shakespeare as he himself wrote it, but I recommend that book if ever you can find it. In any event, Elizabethan English is really not so hard once you read it. You read it slowly the first time with notes. So if you're doing this, this is the first and the only one of 2 plays that are being read without translation in this course. Why did I pick Othello versus the other mature tragedies, such as Hamlet or Macbeth? A short answer to it is this play, Othello, has, in my opinion, a sympathetic character. One that I can bring myself to care about, and a love story that I can bring myself to care about. Whereas, for instance, in Hamlet, it is a matter of supreme indifference any of those characters ever rise to greet another day, in my opinion. The same is true of Macbeth. I don't know King Lear well enough to be that snotty about it. Shakespeare took his political background for this play from a roughly contemporary event, a war over Cyprus about 40 years earlier, so that it would be more or less like a play today based on the Vietnam War. And of course, the personal story of Othello, Desdemona, and Iago is not original by Shakespeare. He rarely, if ever, originated his own stories. The idea of creating your own stories is essentially a 19th century invention. Sophocles took his from Homer, and Shakespeare took his, and everybody basically took the story they found around. And Shakespeare took it from Giovanni Cinthio in a work written in 1566, and this gentleman was a didactic moralist who based his story on an actual murder in Venice around 1508. So basically, as in most of Shakespeare, this is a real-life story with all kinds of changes thrown in. That's your introduction. Plot theme, number 2. And let's use the method of blurting out until we reach a valid formulation. Well, the first thing to blurt out here, we're trying to reach, remember, the plot theme, a statement in essential terms of the action situation. A man becomes jealous. You sure couldn't have this play without that. But as it stands, that is much too broad and generalized. What is he jealous of? His neighbor's money, His friend's social prominence. Wow. And is it justified, his jealousy, or not? It's a very different play if he is crazy or if he's right to become jealous. For instance, his wife is really cheating on him, and he finds that out. So just to say a man becomes jealous tells us no action situation. And notice, there's no conflict in that formulation, and until you have conflict, there is no plot theme. Well, then let's jump to something like this. A jealous man kills his wife. Now we brought in another person, and we know what he's jealous of, presumably. But what is wrong with this? A jealous man kills his wife. That's certainly true. But that is still a summary of the play. It is the final result of the ruling conflict. It is not the essence of the action situation. So that's erring on the side of being too concrete about. That he kills his wife is the resolution of the conflict, and the plot theme has to give you the essence of the action situation. Well, let's approach it from the point of view, what kind of man is acting here? Are we talking about a swine, an average Joe, a fiend? No. Othello is presented from the outset as rational, self-confident, noble, in a word, a hero. And that is essential to the play. Well, if he is a hero, does it then follow that he becomes jealous of his wife for good cause? Because then it would be a very different story. If he comes in and she's sleeping with Cassio, that's a different play. No, this hero becomes irrationally jealous, blindly jealous, jealous despite the facts. Well, now already, to say that he becomes irrationally or blindly jealous of his wife, we have got a beginnings of a situation going. We have at least a mystery. What is the mystery? Why? Why does a hero become blind? See, so that's a more intriguing. It's not yet enough. It's not yet a full situation, because it still subsumes too many possibilities to lead to a distinct play. For instance, you could say, why does he become jealous? That's the way he is. He's a jealous guy. Now that would make the play meaningless, because then the situation would be a jealous man becomes jealous. And that would sink the play. Now you notice that Shakespeare insists, and he is entirely correct in this, that Othello is not easily made jealous. And this is demonstrated right from the outset in the opening characterizing scenes of the play, where Iago is doing everything he can to instigate Othello. Othello is calm, serene. He is just not a jealous type, that's it. Well, we're still back to then, why does this hero become so jealous? Well, let's take a page from the latest issue of Science magazine. Maybe he's got a jealousy gene. It's an inherited tragedy. His chromosomes are warped for jealousy. No, that would be an entirely different play then. What is the essential cause? Now remember, in action terms, not in terms of his soul or character. What in action is the factor that precipitates, pulls, brings about, causes, and rubs and fans and nurtures and causes to flame his jealousy? What is the character, the factor? The manipulations of a black villain, an arch villain. And I insist on the word arch here because Othello is such a hero that only a uniquely wicked villain could topple him. And therefore, I reach very simply the plot theme. A hero, you want me to give you punctuation? See, already we're getting punctuation within the plot theme, so it's a bad omen for the future. A hero, comma, manipulated by an arch villain, comma, becomes blindly jealous of his wife. That's it. Very simple plot theme. I mean, when you get to some of them like Schiller, where we basically have to take an intermission in the dictation because you'll think that this is a very, very simple plot theme. Now, notice, though, that there are all kinds of conflicts built into this very statement. Othello versus Iago. Iago versus Desdemona Othello versus Desdemona when he becomes jealous. Desdemona versus Iago, who want absolutely opposite things. But what is the basic conflict as stated in the plot theme? There's the hero, and then there's the arch villain who manipulates him. So it's Othello versus Iago is the main conflict. Othello wants love, he wants to enjoy his love, he wants to be happy with Desdemona. And Iago wants, now I'm not talking about deeper motives, this is still on the level of plot theme. What does Iago want in action? He wants to break him up. He doesn't want Othello to enjoy this love, he wants to put an end to it. And again, from the plot theme, you should be able to tell not only the main conflict, but the name and number of the indispensable characters. Now, in Antigone, we had 2. Now we're reaching a more complex type of play. How many indispensable characters? Name a number bigger than 2. 3. And there's no play without any one of these. It's a triangle. Obviously, Antigone, Desdemona, Othello, Iago. Now, for some reason, in talking about this play, I have a tendency to use the word Iago instead of Othello. So check up on it. If I do that, just translate it yourself. I don't know why I do that. I'm more impressed with Iago as a character, I think. So whenever I start talking about a man in this play, it comes out as Iago. All right, moving right along to plot development, number 3. In working out this plot theme, which he took from Cinthio, Shakespeare took enormous amounts of detail from the original source, even including the handkerchief. You would be astounded at how little Shakespeare originated in terms of the characters and events of this story. Truly astounded, I was. But Shakespeare did make a few major changes, and that's the difference between a police reporter and a great dramatist. In Cinthio, Iago is jealous of Othello simply because, believe it or not, Iago is in love with Desdemona. So it's just a real ordinary jealousy. Innocent normal motivation compared to Shakespeare's brilliant and monstrous picture of Iago. Or again in Cinthio, Iago beats Desdemona to death himself, and the Moor never becomes aware of her innocence. He never finds out. It's just a sordid story of brutality. Whereas in Shakespeare, it's a true tragedy, a thing of immense stature, because the tragic hero himself does the deed and then grasps what he has done. So this becomes a comment on life, at least life as Shakespeare saw it, and not just a National Enquirer news story. All right, now let's look at the plot development. And as always, in a well-constructed play, there are how many parts? 3. And the first we call the establishment, meaning the establishment of the situation, bringing the basic action situation of the plot theme into reality. And in this play, it is done in Act 1. You have to establish the lovers and the authenticity of their love. You have to Othello urgently must be introduced as a calm, confident type. Otherwise, there's no play. If he comes on as an emotionalist, easily enraged, frothing at the mouth, the play is sunk, because that kind of man that will be back to a jealous man becomes jealous. We also want to establish Iago's hatred of Othello, and at least one step on Iago's part to translate his hatred into reality, so that we know that this is a factor that is not just an emotion. Remember, just an emotion doesn't carry weight. We want to see it enacted, as in life, so in theater. A feeling counts when and if you act on it and do something. So there's a little mini plot on Iago's part right at the outset as part of the establishment, indicating the pattern of the action and the reality of his hatred. That is, his attempt to get revenge on Othello by enraging Brabantio. It fails, but the basic situation is now set. We have the lovers, the calm tranquility of Othello, the hatred of Iago announced right off the bat in the first speech of the play, and the fact that he's going to act on it. So that's your situation. The hero manipulated by the arch villain. Now to the rise to the climax. And here we have a continuous rise, starting with, it encompasses the whole of Act 2 and through Act 3, Scene 3. Starts with the plot against Cassio as a means of getting later to Othello. And you remember that plot culminates in Cassio's dismissal for being drunk and disorderly, and then Iago's diabolical advice that Cassio appealed to the sweet Desdemona to intercede in his behalf. And that framework sets up Iago's direct assault on Othello. And you see an actual rise as in a great playwright. First, a mini crime, the attempt to enrage Brabantio. Then a real crime, but against a subordinate, Cassio, as the first step to the major crime. So it's like waves of greater and greater hatred, greater inaction, building and building. The assault on Othello himself, which is still in the rise to the climax, starts with the beginning of Act 3, and Iago plants suspicions brilliantly in Othello's mind, leading finally to what is called the temptation scene. That is Act 3, Scene 3. And it starts with the words, "Ha, I like not that," said by Iago as Cassio innocently leaves the scene. And he's left with Othello, and he right away casts the implication, there's something I don't like here. So, of course, Othello wants to know what? Oh, no, it's nothing, it's nothing. And then from there they go. And it has been likened to, Iago is like a dentist extracting a tooth from Iago's mouth without anesthetic. It's a careful, gradual surgical operation, a little pull to loosen it, and then a retreat to soothing, "Beware, my lord, don't be jealous, I have only your best interests in mind. There's nothing to get upset about here. Remain calm. Of course it's true that I saw her do this, but that doesn't necessarily, I don't want to speak against her," and so on and so on. Another little yank, and then covered over and smoothed away. Othello grows weaker and more enraged. Iago continues to protest about the sweet Desdemona and how could Othello think such things. Until this is the brilliant turning point scene, until at the end of the temptation scene, the climax of the play. Now remember, the climax, an event, or the major event revealing the final outcome. And this is the scene, the point at which, at the end of the temptation scene, Othello and Iago kneel solemnly and pledge the death of Desdemona. Now, if Othello just said, "Well, you made a good case and stumbled off the stage, that would not be a climax. That would be just, an idea he had drawn. But what makes this so brilliant is that they kneel. They kneel solemnly on the stage, and you have to imagine that this is properly staged. And it becomes a religious rite, R-I-T-E. It becomes a ceremonial declaration. They are pledging, it's the exact equivalent of signing your oath to go into military service or signing away your second mortgage. The decision has now been made by the protagonist. And he says, Othello says, "Now art thou my lieutenant." That's it. In principle, now you know what kind of ending has to occur. Bad, tragic end. That's the climax. And that brings us to the resolution. From Act 3, scene, I guess it's scene 5 to the end. I don't count the clowns. I don't read them, I can't stand them, and I don't put them in when I discuss it. But to me, they are an exquisitely bad taste. Now, whether to blame Shakespeare or the Elizabethan sensibility for those clowns, I don't know, but I won't tolerate them. Now, notice, even though we know in principle already what we think is going to happen, it hasn't really happened yet. We don't know how it's going to happen. That is the bad end of these characters. When it's going to happen, and we still haven't seen it happen, so it's not yet a reality. So there's still plenty of suspense. Will he really do it? Will something happen to stop Othello or change his mind? And notice, even though we're in the resolution, how Shakespeare is going for suspense and doing it brilliantly. He milks Othello's ambivalence. Will he or won't he? Does he love her or does he hate her? Is he going to see the light or is he not? And then come the events, the series that make him harden his already declared resolution. Iago's tissue of lies, the handkerchief, the phony dream. And finally, Iago turns and acts. And then he slaps Desdemona, he calls her a whore, and then almost without pause for breath, her murder, his discovery of the truth, his suicide. The end. Now that is, God knows, a resolution filled with suspense and action. So you have to abandon from your minds the idea that resolution means just stating the self-evident now that you've reached the climax. Usually you can't appreciate that the climax is the climax till you finish the play. And then you go back and see, oh, this is the point at which it was set. But if a bad playwright would be one in which Othello in effect said at the climax, hey folks, this is it, it's all decided now. So there's a subtlety to a good climax that still leaves you hanging, and only in retrospect do you realize that was the high point. But you do respond to it even so. Now I'd like to point out here that this play has a beautiful development, very logically structured. Each event presupposes the earlier and leads to the next. Now I have many things against Shakespeare. He is not a favorite of mine. But I will defend him to the death against the following accusation: that coincidence is a significant factor in this play. Let's restrict it to here, which is commonly said by critics. It is not true. This play does not hinge on coincidence at all. Not if you're talking in essentials. Because Shakespeare's whole point is that whatever happens, Iago is shrewd and manipulative enough to seize on it and still make things go his way. For instance, if Cassio weren't an alcoholic, Iago would find some other way to get him in trouble. He's endlessly fertile in thinking of ways to get people in trouble. And if Desdemona hadn't lied about the hanky, how easy would it have been for Iago to find some other fib or frailty to hang her with? This is highly purposeful drama, which alone without anything else, makes it high and great art. And notice he does this even though plot is not Shakespeare's interest. Nevertheless, he is a master of logical structure. And we have all the requisites here for a great plot development. Clash of opposing motives. A structure of rapidly ascending events, one built upon the other, in this case, rapidly ascending crimes. Intense suspense, and then 3 decisive blows of resolution and finale, like the 3 notes of doom in Beethoven's symphony: death, discovery, suicide, curtain. Now, it is chilling to watch if it's well done. It knocks you over, and like a really profound tragedy that it is, leaves you depressed for days. All right, let us go to number 4, characterization. And again, we're only going to talk about the 3 main characters, and let's start with Othello. As always, there are countless interpretations of Shakespearean characters by critics. You could give a fascinating course on just interpretations of Shakespeare, which in itself would be like a history of modern literature, but I wouldn't do it. But it's commonly said about Othello, there's something stupid about him. He's too easily gulled. How come Iago could get away with taking this calm, serene person and poisoning him so easily? And in fact, leftists commonly say the theme of Othello is the stupidity of the military mind. In any event, dropping aside this nonsense, the real problem in interpreting Othello is to balance his gullibility as against his grandeur, because both elements are there. And the question is to put them together into one person. You have to observe first his truly heroic qualities, which are stressed by Shakespeare from the outset. He's controlled, serene. He has no fear and no anger. He's not seething with violence. And if you see any of these modern neurotic Othellos who are foaming at the mouth in Act 1, allegedly to show their strength, just stop the film. It is not worth even watching. Othello has to be truly a colossal hero, serenely confident, calm. He's had a life of exotic feats. He's in effect really a romantic hero. He's black in his skin color, but he's racially insensitive. He and Desdemona are separated by every known conventional division. Color, black and white. Age, young and old. Country, she's from Venice and he's from the Moors. Class, she's upper class and he's just a soldier. But although I believe, if I remember, he has some royal parentage somewhere lost in the background. But the point is, he's a man of self-esteem, and none of these differences with Desdemona is even an issue to him. None is important to his love for her. Now, his love for Desdemona, notice, is sexual, but not primarily so. It's not platonic, and it's not just a lust of the flesh. Its root is spiritual. They love each other's characters, and they tell us why right at the outset, and they have good reasons. He is not a man driven by passion or whim. His emotions, as presented in Act 1, are integrated with his thoughts. His love for Desdemona, his main thing in Act 1, is spiritual and physical. It's a true mind-body integration. So Othello is man at his best, according to Shakespeare, and he's wholly admirable in Act 1. Now, of course, I say in parentheses that it's really crucial for the story that you buy his love for Desdemona, and vice versa. If you don't buy into the love story, you may as well close this play. You won't care. Now, I did. I have, if I say so myself, a well-developed ability to empathize with love stories if I can possibly, if they give me one finger that I can sympathize with, I can worm my way into it. And I did in this case, and that's the reason, that's what saved the play, or made it possible for me to read with suspense and involvement. Now, I just want to point out as a technical skill on Shakespeare's part, what a tremendously difficult feat this is. The whole thing depends on him being able to make the love story real in a very brief space, in just a few speeches. And then that love story, that love has to endure on the viewer or reader for 4 acts in which all you actually see is their increasing alienation and distrust. So it's a tremendous literary challenge. And if I said to you, this is your literary assignment, as part of a council meeting, you got a speech or two, brief, to make real the immortal love of these 2 characters, and then we're never going to see it again, and yet it must haunt us for the rest of the play. Go and do it in half a page. I venture to say that you couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. That in itself is such a feat that you have to just faint in awe, and I just want to give you just a conclusion of that. What I think was such a fantastic achievement, that speech that in the book we're using, is this the book we're using? Well, no, it isn't. We're on Act 1, Scene 3, the speech that starts of Othello, about line 128. Her father loved me, oft invited me, still questioned me the story of my life, and then he goes on to tell all of the things that happened to him. And then near the conclusion, line 160, she swore, it's Desdemona, swore in faith 'twas strange, 'twas passing strange. 'Twas pitiful, 'twas wondrous pitiful. She wished she had not heard it, yet she wished that heaven had made her such a man. She thanked me and bade me if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that would woo her. Upon this hint I spake, and then they summarize it in 2 lovely, eloquent lines. She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. So, it's a love of mutual understanding. She knows his life, she admires him for the hero he has been, and he loves her for being the kind of woman who can understand what he is and what he's done. All right, now we go back to what happens to Othello if he started off on this exalted plane. At the beginning, he's man at his best, and then quickly. He passes, in effect, from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde. By the end of Act 3, he's deranged and brimming with hatred. Now, it's important for you to note that Iago never offers any objective evidence to support his various insinuations. There is nothing that would stand up in a court of law or to a dispassionate judge. His whole case is made of little impressions, none of which would stand the light of objective scrutiny. Cassio laughs, and he makes a federal case out of that, Iago. The hanky. Desdemona intercedes on behalf of Cassio for mercy, etc. A whole accumulation of little nothings. But Othello never questions the evidential value of these. He never asks any questions. He accepts them at once as though it's self-evident. In other words, this rational, calm, objective man has lost his rationality. He becomes completely credulous. He's run only by Iago's manipulations. And this state of affairs is symbolized by Othello's epileptic fit, the exact opposite of Othello as he came on stage. So it's like, if you know Hegel, the thesis became the antithesis. And then we have the synthesis in Act 5. in the murder scene. It is the cause, he says, as he's going to murder her. What does he mean by it is the cause? In other words, I'm acting from from justice, not jealousy or base motives. He's aware enough that there is such a thing as a cuckolded husband who wants revenge, but he tells himself, I am acting as a man of reason. I am taking an act of justice, not revenge. So he knows the issue, but nevertheless, jealousy is still running him, unknown to himself, warping him. He's still torn and ambivalent. You see the two Othellos back and forth. The good Othello pulls back, the bad Othello urges him on. He loves her, he hates her, he kills her. And then this typical double meaning line of Shakespeare, so eloquent. He's holding a lit candle. He says, put out the light, and then put out the light. That is the light of her life, and thus of his own, which is just what happens. So at the start, he's allied with Desdemona. That's the good Othello. He sees the world through her beauty and goodness. She becomes, in effect, his view of life. And then Iago ensnares him, and he becomes allied with Iago. And that's the jealous berserk Othello. A metaphysical change from the preceding. His whole view of life has just diametrically changed. He adopts Iago's view of people. Wherever he looks, he sees nothing but sluts and crooks. And then again, at the end, he's allied with Desdemona, but too late. But he's allied with her. He returns to his better self. But by the time he finds out the truth about her, she is dead and he is doomed. Now, why these changes in Othello? Why did he succumb as he did to Iago? Why did he find himself again too late? Those are the questions we want to explore as we continue, and I'm now going to take the 6-minute break, during which you should receive a handout of questions on these plays. 6 minutes. Thank you. Let us turn now to the analysis of Iago. Othello is mixed or ambivalent. Iago is not. He represents utter, total evil. He is the blackest character in Shakespeare, and in fact, to my knowledge, in all world literature. Notice that he does not start with a specific idea of death for Desdemona. That develops as the play progresses. The start on page 1 is Iago hates the Moor. That's the beginning of the play and the key to Iago. What then is the motive of this creature? Well, the poet Coleridge, who was a great literary critic as well as poet, gave an intriguing but inaccurate answer, which is a good way to get started here. He said, Iago is run by motiveless malignity. Now, in a sense, this is true, because he is motiveless in the sense that all of his stated motives for hating Othello are cover-ups, rationalizations. They are not his true reason for acting as he does. For example, he says he's jealous of Cassio's military position. But Iago is not run by any career interest or passion. He shows no interest in the military field. He even sneers at it. Or again, he says he suspects Othello of cuckolding him with his wife. This is made up out of whole cloth. There isn't a shred of basis for it, and he immediately forgets all about it. Or again, he says, I love Desdemona and I'm jealous. And you can only say to that, BS. I mean, there isn't a shred of truth in it. All of his alleged motives that he gives are like that. They're casual, spur of the moment, unreal. And in that way, it's exactly like the arguments you hear against capitalism. You refute one, they come up with three more. Then they drop them under pressure, and then they move on to the next. What then is real and enduring about Iago? He wants to poison Othello's joy. He wants to cut him down, destroy him, for no positive reason, for no reward. He has no loves or passions to achieve. And so you can see Coleridge's plausibility, motiveless malignity. But in fact, if we look a little deeper, we will see that Iago is not motiveless. He has no journalistic motive, no specific value he's seeking. But he does have a metaphysical motive that is driving him. What is it? Well, other critics have called him, I don't write this down because it's wrong, a devil worshiper, a Satanist, a man in love with evil. That gives him far too much credit. Iago is not in love with anything. That is the whole essence of him. What then is his true motive? Well, Shakespeare actually knew it. And one other person since Shakespeare has known it. Now, I want to quote you fragments from an article you may very well have read. You try and guess the author. Which is not written with Othello in mind, with this play in mind. Quote, hatred of the good for being the good means hatred of that which one regards as good by one's own judgment. Its exponents do not experience love for evil men. Their emotional range is limited to hatred or indifference. For example, a person who characteristically resents someone's success, happiness, achievement, or good fortune, and experiences pleasure at someone's failure, unhappiness, or misfortune. The hater has nothing to lose or gain in such instances. No practical value at stake, no existential motive. So what the hater wants is not the values he purports to envy, but the other man's loss of them. And of course I'm quoting Ayn Rand, and she goes on to quote John Galt. They do not want to own your fortune, they want you to lose it. They do not want to succeed, they want you to fail. They do not want to live, they want you to die. They desire nothing, they hate existence. Unquote. This, of course, is from the Age of Envy, and it is a perfect description of Iago. Perfect. Nothing less would cover him, nothing else is required. And notice how conscious Shakespeare was. Iago, for instance, at one point explicitly hates Cassio because he says Cassio has a beauty that makes him, Iago, ugly. And so he hates Cassio for that. Now, I don't think you can give Shakespeare high enough praise for having this psychological insight, the true psychological genius to grasp such a motive. His depth of thought here, his metaphysical depth, is just truly astonishing. It's an epical feat in itself to be able to think in such terms, to depict a character of such consistency that wasn't even dreamt of for centuries and took a world historical genius to define. So I want to give Shakespeare every kind of credit I can because in many ways he deserves it. But, and with Shakespeare there's always a but, I want you to observe the other characteristics he also gives to Iago, as though they go along perfectly with this nihilism, this hatred of the good. In 3 words, Iago is also supposed to be the man of action, the man of reason, and the man of selfishness. I want to elaborate each briefly. Iago is the active character, and in that sense, regardless of the title of the play, he is really the protagonist, the first prime mover. All the key developments in the play are initiated and directed by him. He creates the plot against Cassio. He orchestrates Roderigo's movements. He arranges the handkerchief episode. He plants the doubts in Othello, etc. Relatively speaking, Othello and Desdemona are passive. They're like puppets. Iago pulls the strings. Well, how come Iago has so much initiative and control over events? How come he's the man of action? That brings us to the second point. He is presented as being free of emotion, free of passion, as he himself says explicitly, and therefore he can be guided purely by the mind, purely by intelligence. And he says in one of his famous speeches, "We have reason to cool our raging motions." Yes, Iago is the man who is presented as intelligent, shrewd. The others live in their dreams and fantasies, but he perceives reality. He has no delusions. He grasps the flow of events. He's instantaneous to adapt to events in a second. He is the cool, unfeeling calculator, pure thought. And thus, as he says in his speech, the master of himself. Now, I refer you to this speech, which I won't take the time to read. Act 1, Scene 3, lines 318 to 330. A speech that sounds like it could have been written by an objectivist. And it's the arch villain explaining that the way to be a man of reason is to have no feelings. And then you'll have free will, and you'll be able to be the master of your destiny, as long as you rid yourself of any values, in effect. So, it was a baffling speech to me the first time I read it because I thought, does Shakespeare agree with this? Is Iago really the hero? I couldn't make head or tail of it. And then I finally figured it out. So the nihilist, the hater of the good for being the good, is the source of action, the dynamo. He's the thinker, and he is the egoist. Iago, as you may see, is etymologically related to ego. Geo, get it? So that means he's supposed to value only himself. And of course, himself means his whims, his destructiveness. Notice the stress on Iago's cynicism. You know what a cynic is? Somebody who believes that virtue is impossible. No one is any good. They're all pigs, so I can justifiably do whatever I want with them. And you notice, I hope you got that message from his famous line about Desdemona. And they're saying what a wonderful woman she is and so on, and he says, the wine she drinks is made of grapes. You know what that means? She's human just like the rest of us. There's nothing so special about her. This exact same line was stated by a commentator that may be before your time, Eric Sevareid, at the time of man's first spaceship launch into space, and the whole country was transfixed and watching the screen, and Sevareid said, I don't know what all the excitement is about. These astronauts put their pants on one leg at a time. They're just human like everybody else, and this is that perfect line from Shakespeare. The wine she drinks is made of grapes. It's not the nectar of the gods. She's just down here in the muck with everybody else. And that is Iago's perspective, you see. It's not Shakespeare's perspective. He thinks virtue is possible. Desdemona is an example of it. But it's Iago's perspective. And that's supposed to be the real egotist's perspective. Now, you've heard of A.C. Bradley, a famous Shakespearean interpreter, also a Hegelian in his own thinking. I'll read you a little quote on Iago from Bradley. And you have to remember, Bradley, etc., this is how these plays are taught to students to this day. A quote from Bradley. In intellect and in will, Iago is great. To what end does he use these great powers? His creed, for he is no skeptic, he has a definite creed, is that absolute egoism is the only rational and proper attitude. and that conscience or honor of any kind of regard for others is an absurdity, unquote. Now, you see that it's hopeless to teach literature if you don't know objectivism. You see the importance of philosophy even to understanding the great classics. Now, just as we leave Iago, I'd like to point out to you that Shakespeare gave Iago more lines than any other character in any other play. He was obviously fascinated by this character. But what message does he want us to get from this monster with his mixture of traits? What is the deeper meaning of this portrait? Well, put that on hold along with the questions about Othello. And let's look finally in our discussion of characterization at Desdemona. Now, she is the opposite of Iago, 100% virtue, Christian virtue. She's meek. She accepts anything without protest, even her own murder. She turns the other cheek, she forgives. And of course, this is essential to the play. If Desdemona were not a thorough Christian, if she were not so intent on forgiveness, there could be no play. Suppose, for instance, when Othello first slapped her or cursed her, she asserted herself, became enraged, cried out, "This is unfair to me." Suppose she'd said to him indignantly, "What the hell is the matter with you?" In other words, she confronted Othello head on and stood up to him. That would have been the best proof to him of her honesty, her innocence, and it would have been a chance to save herself and him. But she doesn't dream of doing this. She is always forgiving, loving, self-denying. Whatever he says, it's all my fault. He calls her a whore, and her statement is, "'Tis meet I should be used so very meet. How have I been behaved that he might stick the smallest opinion on my least misuse?" In other words, what have I done that he could think this of me? I deserve it completely. So her Christian virtue is essential to Iago's plan. So we have the traditional dichotomy. Iago is the sacrificer of others to himself. And Desdemona, the opposite, sacrifice of self to others. Now, Othello, unfortunately, is not a third viewpoint. He just oscillates between the two. So what is missing morally? What third alternative is wholly absent from the characterizations of the play? The man of what Ayn Rand would call self-sustaining ego, the objectivist egoism, true independence from others. That idea would kill off both Iago and Desdemona and thus wipe out the story. So Desdemona is a standard Christian heroine. Now, Shakespeare himself was not religious, but he accepted the Christian definition of virtue, and of course non-believers still do so to this very day, because there's never been another definition for them to accept. Now, if you want an idea of to what depths Christianity has brought civilization, just contrast Desdemona with Antigone. Two leading females. One, a creature with no spirit, no will, no fire, utterly drab and blah. And you know what I think of the other. In any event, that gives us the three main characters of the play. And they've all been taken quite legitimately as Christian symbols. Even though, as I say, Shakespeare is not a believer, Christianity was so built into the culture that even unbelievers used all the symbolism. Iago is the serpent or tempter. He's like Satan. Desdemona is the pure, the angelic, the Christ-like. And Othello, caught between the two, moving back and forth between them, better than one but not equal to the other, represents man. Now, that's what you call a philosophic play, when you can have those kind of characters, and not just as, empty archetypes, but taking part in ongoing, complex, suspenseful action. You are talking here about a playwright, and not just a guy that writes plays. All right, now let's go to number 5, the theme. the abstract message of this play. Not yet the total philosophy, but the message or principle that the events directly dramatize. Here are some key data for the theme. Iago, who is evil for evil's sake, ends in ruin. Desdemona, who is total virtue, ends in ruin. Othello, the best of human beings, neither angel nor demon, ends in ruin. What is the message? No, the message is not the necessity of ruin. No, you're wrong. I'm going to tell you the theme in a sentence and then elaborate it at some length. The theme is virtue and vice are irrelevant to life. Or put another way, moral character is irrelevant to one's destiny. Now, in elaborating this theme, I have a tremendous advantage that I have on no other play, which is that I once had to teach this play many years ago and was quite unsure on how to interpret it. And I had a memorable 4 or 5 hour discussion with Ayn Rand on this play. It's the only one in this course that I ever was able to talk to her about. I mean, I was able, but I just didn't have the brains to think of talking to her about it. And knowing that I had to teach this the next day, I wrote furiously. I tried to be accurate, so what I'm going to give you, except where it's obviously not her, from this point on is going to be her words as she said them, it's going on 25 years ago now, as well as I could take them down. And I had tremendous skills as a note taker because my claim to fame was that I could get down what she said and then go home and try and figure it out. So I said to her, what does this play mean? Now, what follows is essentially her words. She said, Ariel, a spirit in the tempest, states the essence of Shakespeare's viewpoint and the theme of this play in his line, "What fools these mortals be." Why are they fools? Well, she went on, some people have she's speaking for Shakespeare now, some people have the illusion that virtue is important. Others are obsessed with their sinfulness or evil. They think that's important. Whereas I, Shakespeare, am Olympian, detached. I'm wise enough to be above it all. I see the futility of morality. The futility of morality. Desdemona happens to be good. It doesn't help her. Iago is monstrous. Same end. They are fools because they think their actions, their character, their decisions matter in life. And the truth is, good and evil are inconsequential. So there's no point in urging virtue or denouncing vice. Now, I interject here on my own a contrast to the Antigone, so you're not confused. Sophocles upholds the vital importance of morality. For example, vice is the downfall of Creon, who is specifically punished for his evil. Sophocles does hold that there are some unknowable powers at work in the universe, but he insists nevertheless that morality is one crucial factor in our destiny, that we should struggle to be moral and that we have at least a chance then. He would never say morality is irrelevant. Remember, he is religious, he's still a moralist, as against Shakespeare. Now returning to Miss Rand's analysis. Get Shakespeare's true message here, she told me. He's not Greek, but nor is he Christian, because the traditional Christian would say life has a moral outcome, if not here on earth, then in the next world. And Shakespeare says, no, a man's outcome has no relation to moral character. So then I said, well, I guess Shakespeare believes that life is just necessarily tragic, like Byron or Schopenhauer. She said, no. Byron or Schopenhauer believed that man is doomed by a hostile universe set against him. No, that, she said, is not Shakespeare's view, because he believes that happy endings are possible. He wrote many comedies. Many of his characters, even in the tragedies, succeed. or end up ahead of the game. For instance, Cassio in this play escapes Iago's net and ends up governor. But the point is, how does he escape? It's not that there's an evil world out to smash everybody. He escapes by pure chance. The point is, some people succeed, some fail. We're not all doomed, but what happens, this is the key point, is haphazard. It takes place regardless of their merits, regardless of the merits or demerits of the characters. So that's a very distinctive viewpoint. It's not synonymous with everything is rotten. Now I'll come back to Ms. Rand in a moment, but I want to work out in a little more detail how his theme, the irrelevance of morality, is dramatized in the play. Because he's so brilliant in dramatizing a theme that you could just faint from admiration, leaving aside whether you agree with the theme. Now first consider virtue and how he dramatizes its irrelevance to life. Now virtue for Shakespeare is Christian virtue, as we said, self-sacrifice. So he's got a pretty good thing to do here, because we know that that kind of virtue does and must lead its exponents eventually to destruction. So he just has to play Christianity to its natural conclusion. Now here's a wonderful horror quote from A.C. Bradley on Desdemona's plight. This is apropos of the rewards or the plight of virtue. Bradley, of course, is a thorough Christian. My hair stood on end when I read this quote. Quote, Desdemona is helplessly passive. She can do nothing whatever. She cannot retaliate even in speech. And the chief reason of her helplessness only makes the sight of her suffering more exquisitely painful. She is helpless because her nature is infinitely sweet and her love absolute. Unquote. In other words, she's so good as to be emasculated or effeminized. Now, Shakespeare applies this same type of point more broadly to every kind of virtue, including legitimate virtue. In other words, what you in this room would regard as virtue. Every evil scheme of Iago's depends on his victims' weaknesses, true, but also on their virtues, their real virtues. For instance, Cassio couldn't be provoked to rage by Iago if he weren't himself a man of honor. Othello had to be a sincere, impassioned lover, or he would have been impervious to Iago's instigations. Desdemona had to want generously to intercede on Cassio's behalf and then to remain loyal to her promise to him to continue pleading his case with Othello. In all these cases, true virtue is essential for Iago's scheme. And you think that this is an accident, this is a master we're talking about. Shakespeare tells us that flat out in Act 2, Scene 3, line 336. There's a crucial speech by Iago. He makes his plans at that point, and then he says, "So will I turn her virtue into pitch," into blackness, you see, "and out of her own goodness make the net that shall enmesh them all." Unquote. Now, it's really important that you understand this. A student once asked me, isn't this same thing true of Ayn Rand's heroes also? Namely, that the characters suffer because of their virtues, which are exploited by the villains. Now, take 15 seconds to think why this is not true of objectivist heroes. It's the exact opposite situation with objectivism. How many are stopped momentarily by this question? I mean, you don't have an immediate answer. Oh, if there's that few people, I guess I don't have to give it them. But the actual answer is, Ayn Rand's heroes allow themselves to be exploited because they lack knowledge. It's not their virtues which do them in, but their ignorance. Their virtues are what keep them looking for the truth and eventually make them succeed. Reardon, for example, is not a victim because he is rational, independent, and productive. Those are the qualities that enable him to discover his victimization. He is the victim because he does not know what the world owes him, and his very virtues lead him to discover it. Now, Shakespeare is the exact opposite here. The very virtues of the characters make them vulnerable. For instance, Othello's passionate love, a legitimate major virtue, or Desdemona's self-sacrifice, a Christian virtue. It is the virtues themselves, Christian or otherwise, which are the obstacles to their success. To succeed, they would need not more knowledge, but an opposite character. So the virtues here play into the hands of the evil, they make the evil possible, and thereby lead to their own destruction. Now look at vice. Does this all mean that evil is therefore all-powerful for Shakespeare? No. And here the key point is the fragility of Iago's scheming. At any moment, his whole plot could collapse. At one question from Othello or Desdemona. Observe the outright stupidity of Iago's final oversight. He neglects to take account of Emilia's entirely predictable reaction, her horror at discovering Desdemona's death. And she's going to immediately tell the whole story. And suddenly a couple of, unfortunate letters come to light, and bang, within an instant, it's all over, it's curtains for Iago. In other words, Iago is a fool too. And Shakespeare is highly conscious of that and is presenting that. The message is not the power of vice over virtue. Iago is crushed, silenced, and the implication is tortured to death. His machinations collapse like a house of cards, and he is ruined along with virtually everybody else. And now, still on the theme, I'm going to go back to Miss Rand's words. She said to me, Shakespeare does not give a damn. He doesn't like Othello or Desdemona. He doesn't hate Iago. He draws black and white characters, but they mean nothing to him personally. He's not a cynic. He does not agree with Iago. He has characters that he considered true virtue. He's not despairing or rebellious in the face of the tragedy of life. He accepts the tragedy with a smile of detachment. He's not amoral in the sense of presenting gray characters like today's writers. He's not an amoralist who says, who knows the difference between good and evil? We can't distinguish it. Morality is a sham. Then she gave this marvelous description to him. She said, Shakespeare is a special kind of moralist, a psychopathic moralist. In other words, he recognizes the distinction, he writes about it, and he doesn't give a damn about it. She said to me, he's a great poet, a great artist, but if he saw Auschwitz or Atlantis from Atlas Shrugged, he would have the same basic reaction. If he saw Auschwitz, he would write beautiful poetry on gas chamber deaths. Oh, mournful, insidious fumes. If he saw Gulf Motor, oh, glittering, sunken invention that from the bosom of the airy current draws forth. So Ayn Rand calls him a dead soul, a man whose reaction to Galt or Iago is the same. Now, a few last formulations that I copied from my conversation with her. I wish I had thought to do it with every author in history, but at that time, I was completely into philosophy. I thought literature is a waste of time. I was saddled with this assignment, so I did it on this one play only. She said to me, but she was full of these brilliant lines if only someone had got them out of her. She said to me, Shakespeare makes a virtue out of the inefficacy of virtue. And then again she said, he regards man as important but denies what is important in him. namely the power of moral value. And then the last line of hers that I remember from that conversation, Shakespeare is a great artist, aesthetically, and I loathe him. Now that is the conclusion of my quotation from her. Now let us say a few words about Shakespeare's broader philosophy. I think we can get that in today and actually finish this play today. We want to look at the ideas that were the context for Shakespeare's principle of the inefficacy of virtue. The deeper roots of this idea are all over the play and his other plays as well. And here are some key ones. The most obvious, perhaps, is determinism. Man has no choice about his nature, whether he's good or evil, and so he has no control over his life. He is helpless. Human helplessness, our lack of choice or control, is a fundamental of Shakespeare's philosophy. And what is it that Othello says at the end that is the perfect, eloquent summary of this in a short line? O vain boast, who can control his fate? And of course, the implicit answer is no one. So morality cannot be a force in human life. It simply can't in logic, because morality is the means that a volitional being uses to select his course. Without volition, morality is just a redundancy. It has no function, and that's just what Shakespeare holds it to be. A kind of private game of status or emotion that has no role and no effects in life. Now, why is Shakespeare so profound a determinist? To get a little deeper, why does he hold that man is helpless? Well, one deeper reason is that he is a strong subscriber to the dichotomy of reason and emotion, the mind-body dichotomy. And in that sense, he's a faithful Platonist, even though he's not otherworldly. Man, for Shakespeare, is made of two elements, intrinsically opposed. You can't live with them or without them. Reason and emotion. If you try to live by reason, he thinks exclusively by reason. The result is going to be, well, for instance, Hamlet, the indecisive intellectual, always weighing pros and cons, paralyzed because he has no passion to guide him. If you try to live by reason, it's Hamlet or Iago. They're both the intellectual side of the dichotomy. And Iago, of course, as we've seen, is the true non-valuer, the non-feeler of anything, pure calculation. And that's a disaster, Shakespeare sees. But on the other hand, if you allow emotion into the picture, then it's going to topple your reason. And then the result is going to be Macbeth, where ambition gets let loose, or Othello, where love gets let loose, and you get dragged to some emotionless disaster. And so we have the tragic flaw in all of Shakespeare's tragedies, the feet of clay of even his greatest heroes. And the flaw ultimately is not any one passion, such as jealousy or anger, etc. The flaw is the metaphysical makeup of man. A creature with two halves at war. You can't live by either half alone, yet, so it seemed to him, you can't integrate the two into any kind of unity. Now, the originators of the mind-body dichotomy back in ancient Greece, for instance, Plato, nevertheless were able to experience hope in this plight. Hope thanks to their religion. They thought that one day they would transcend the conflicts of this world for the gods or the next life. But Shakespeare is a modern, an early modern. Religion is not a force to him. An afterlife is not an issue. There is only this earth for him. But he accepts the legacy of religion unquestioningly. Not only the equation of virtue with sacrifice, but the mind-body dichotomy in most of its forms. And the result is He has all the helplessness of the religious view of man without their hope of redemption. He has only the futility. In effect, he feels there is no way to live. The earth is unbearable, and there's no heaven to anticipate any longer. So we must give up the pretense of valuing. Now, by the way, this is not Shakespeare's unique evil or error. This was common in the late Renaissance. As men threw over the Christian code, they were not automatically turned into objectivists. On the contrary, they were left with no code, and they were even more helpless and depressed in many ways than they were in the medieval period. And if you want another example from a contemporary of Shakespeare, I suggest that you read Cervantes' Don Quixote, which was written in Spain at exactly the same time. Cervantes and Shakespeare died on the same day in the same year. And they had the same philosophy. Don Quixote was insane because he held ideals, and he soon learns, that he's got to come down to earth. You just can't be impassioned for ideals because it's hopeless, because they don't know what ideal to be for anymore. And so it's a much broader cultural issue. It would be really fascinating to give a course on Renaissance skepticism, and I intend to do that within the next 12 months. But the famous line from Othello, which summarizes this: he loved not wisely, but too well. He loved too well. Now you stop and think about that. How is it possible to value your beloved too strongly? Not in an objectivist world. Impossible. And just like thinking too well, reasoning too well, loving too well. I mean, those are inherently, he doesn't say he loved her, inappropriately or irrationally. He loved her without restraint. But the thing is, he couldn't therefore stand for her to disappoint him. And the moral he draws is, don't be such a valuer. Sophocles, I grant you, implied the danger of love, as in some of the later odes in Antigone. But he obviously admired Antigone for her love of her brother and her passion for morality. But Sophocles' ambivalence has become Shakespeare's unbreached conviction. It is self-destructive to love. That's his message. That's his philosophy. You cannot care for the good too much, not in a world where it is impossible or irrelevant. If Othello had not loved Desdemona as he did, Iago couldn't have reached and destroyed Othello. Safety, in effect, consists in not caring, in remaining passive, stoical, resigned, above it all. So Shakespeare is a thorough malevolent universer. His works are the voice of doom, but not as a primary. As an effect of all the rest of his philosophy is what leads him to this sense of hopelessness. And then, of course, once malevolent universe is established in his soul, a vicious circle takes place. The malevolence once accepted becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes the cause of even more defeats and even more malevolence. So much for the general philosophy of Shakespeare. Now, as with Sophocles, I can't, but I would like to praise Shakespeare as a stylist, as a writer, as an artist. Again, he is so great an artist that to do even cursory justice would take hours of analyzing examples from just this one play even. His ability to write great poetry, truly elevated poetry, but not merely empty rhetoric, always with a full substance and content. His purposefulness, his immense economy of language. Every word is weighed and counted. Also, the grand scale nature of his vision and his characterizations.
the brilliance, the genius, the sensory vividness of his metaphors and imagery. I mean, I tried to make a list. It's just impossible. I'd have to recite the whole play. At the very start, when Iago says to Brabantio, "Your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs." Is that evocative? Do you see it? And all the way through to the very end, to Othello's last speech, "Soft you, a word or two before you go." He tells them to tell his story to the world, and he concludes, "Tell them of one whose hand threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe, of one whose subdued eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood," that is to weeping, "drop tears as fast as the Arabian trees their medicinable gum. And say besides that in Aleppo," that's Turkey once, "where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced, insulted the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus," stabs himself. That's what you call a death scene. Now, in the 19th century, audiences during the murder scene would yell out to Othello, and they're very restrained, reserved 19th century audiences, "Don't do it, she's innocent." They actually had to watch the wings of the stage because spectators, dressed in tie and tails and so on, would leap on stage to stop them. And that is how deep their experience actually went. And despite all the disagreements between objectivism and Shakespeare, I hope that you too can get so deeply involved in this great play and that it has added something to your life that you would not want to have missed. I know that it has done that for me. Thank you. Now, I'm going to take advantage of my permission occasionally to stray a little bit past we still have 8 minutes officially, and then another 5 or 10 thrown in to make up for the break and so on. And before we go to questions, I want to point out that someone in the audience has just handed me this. William Shakespeare, Othello, the entire text unabridged and unexpurgated in comic strip form. So this is published by, this person certainly deserves a plug, this publisher. Now, I've never heard of this publisher, but Oval Projects, it's in London, wouldn't you know? Oval Projects Limited, Sidgwick and Jackson, 335 Kennington Road, London. And it starts with the title page with pictures of them all, Othello, etc., the whole works, and fascinating. So if you find that takes the curse off Elizabethan English, Shakespeare it's very easy to read if you get used to Elizabethan English. Read 3 plays, and then it just becomes like English, that's all. Now, just before we turn to take a few questions, I want to be sure that you got this paper on these plays. This is not to be handed in. Unfortunately, I would not have the time to read 250 pages. But it will be discussed in Lecture 8. That will be Lecture 8. We'll take up this paper, perhaps get you to volunteer some of your answers, and then I'll tell you mine with the reasoning. You can answer right on the paper. You can keep it. And what I would suggest you do is take a sheet of paper of your own and just number it 1 through 15. Don't write on this original paper. And after each play, like today, you got 2 plays now, Antigone and Shakespeare. Go down the 15 questions and put your provisional answer. Who is the strongest heroine? Now your choice so far is Antigone or Desdemona. It's very easy so far, okay? Which character would you most like to sleep with? Very limited choice so far. But which story do you most like? That may give you more of a pause right now. Which play most admirably integrates theme and plot? That may give you a pause. And then the last 4 are the biggies that we're really building up to, because the first 11 are the material for them. Speaking purely aesthetically, which is objectively the best play? Speaking purely philosophically, which is objectively the best play? Taking both art and philosophy into account, which is objectively the best play? Which of the 7 is your personal favorite? And I allow, as I'll explain, a different answer for that than to the others. Now, as a matter of fact, I will tell you that my answers to 12, 13, 14, and 15 invoked 4 different plays out of the 7. So it's like an Oscar with ones going to all of them, you know. So try and keep it up to date as we go along, because otherwise you're going to find yourself the night before thinking, oh God, I can't even remember the characters in this play, and I've got to compare 7 stories and 15 characters, etc. You'll never do it. And then bring it with your answers and hopefully have some reasons for your answers so that you can, we can get into some kind of discussion. Now, I'm going to allow 10 minutes for questions on Shakespeare, and you just come to the mic. If you don't have any questions and you're hungry, we're within 3 minutes of our time, so I won't take offense if you want to leave. All right, yes.
I believe it was Aristotle who said that tragedies are written in times of moral upheaval, at times when people are caught between 2 moral codes. And I think that would be the case in both Antigone and with Shakespeare in the late Renaissance. And do you see that that's happening here, or that that's a factor in both of these plays?
Well, let me try to get that down, Betsy, because you've got several different points there. Tragedies have been written from the beginning to the end, at all times and in all periods. So it would be incorrect to say they're only in times of moral upheaval.
Great tragedy.
Certainly, if your moral code is ambivalent or uncertain, that in itself is going to give you a tragic sense of life. But if your moral code is completely consistent and is wrong completely, as for instance the medieval tragedy, that is going to give you a tragic sense of life, which is not changed by the fact that they're going to be happy in the next life. In this world, it's still tragedy. Mm-hmm. So, in order to write a non-tragedy, you must implicitly or explicitly have an unbreached positive philosophy. You must at least potentially, to some extent, be able to view life as open to man and have a moral code which permits him to succeed. And you know from the writings of objectivism how rare that is. Even the Romantics in the 19th centuries wrote tragedies when they believed in human freedom and they had political freedom. Even they, like Victor Hugo, ended with tragedy. Again, that you could say, well, they had an ambivalent moral code. Well, yes, but then you're not saying anything because you're not excluding anything. There are still tragedies. And I want to add one further point. Man's ability to achieve his values is not entirely dependent on his own volitional choice. For instance, we the living. Now that is a tragedy. It's a tragedy even though Kira at the end says, you know, life is still possible. She reaffirms in her soul the possibility of life. But in actual fact, all of the characters die, as in Shakespearean or Greek tragedy. Now there, it's not because of a metaphysics, but because of a political situation. Nevertheless, a tragedy is very, very all-encompassing. And it's a very rare feat to be able to write a non-tragedy. So it's broader than what you said. We have some non-tragedies in this course, so just wait for further discussion. But don't be surprised by how many tragedies great works are, because mankind's thinking has been in a mess. If you try to write a serious work about life in the universe with your thinking in a mess, your conclusion is going to be, what a disaster we're facing. Now, I'd like to try to get some people that didn't get yesterday first, and then we'll have repeats. So somebody that didn't speak yesterday, yes. Is there somebody there? Come up. Just force your way like, right, okay.
I had a question about the way you analyze the plays. I wanted to know how you came to the conclusion of these 6 points are the points by which we should understand all the plays.
Well, that's a good question. I'd like to have given a lecture on methodology. Well, there's not really 6 points, because the introduction is simply general cultural knowledge. So you have some idea that this is ancient Greece rather than modern England or whatever. You don't have to know the dates of the playwright. You don't have to know his name even. You don't have to know that this was his 37th play. And all of that is sort of just thrown in as background. So the real analysis is really only 3 things that I am doing, because I don't have time for style. And style is a very treacherous and difficult thing. To do style, you have to go far beyond the play you're reading. You have to read that play. You have to know all the other main plays of the character, of the author, so you can see, you can abstract what is true of him generally and not just in this play. And then you have to know his contemporaries. So you can say, you see, this is distinctive to Shakespeare, and is not true of Marlowe and so on, who were his contemporaries. If you don't know that, you may be giving Shakespeare praise or blame for something that was inherent in the whole Elizabethan era. That's why I have to frankly admit to you that I am not knowledgeable enough to comment intelligently on style. All I can do in regard to style is say, I like this for these obviously good reasons, but I haven't captured what's distinctive about any of these. So taking away introduction and style, what the real 3 things that I talk about are plot, characters, and meaning. And then it becomes a simple question. That's the 3 levels. If it's a play without any one of those 3, it's out as far as art is concerned. It's got to have action. Otherwise, it's just philosophy, it's nonfiction. Action has to have actors, so there must be characters. And if it means nothing, literally even by implication, is not art. Art is by its nature implicitly philosophical. Now, I'm happy to take plays that are more explicitly philosophical, but you can't have art without meaning. So those 3 you can't escape. Plot, action, and characters are unavoidable in a literary art, and meaning in any art. Now, meaning has to be last. It has to be last, because on what are you going to base it? You don't just come and say, well, I just read a speech by Iago on the importance of reason, therefore Shakespeare is in favor of reason. Well, you can't take that speech out of context. Who is Iago? What was he doing? So meaning has to come at the end. Where do you have to start? Your choice, therefore, is action or character. To start. Now, can you start with character? No, I agree with Aristotle 100%. The most important thing in literature is action. We hold values for the sake of achieving them in action. Our characters are the automatized values that will guide us in behavior. Therefore, the thing that counts in life and in art, the metaphysical primary, the important thing is what we do. Not a primary in the sense that it has no cause, but a primary in the sense that that is what is important. If you sit back and study objectivism until you're blue in the face, and you express passion for it and so on, and when the time comes you vote for Hitler and shrug, it doesn't make any difference. That one action wipes out all the rest. So if we showed you throughout the whole life studying and praising Ayn Rand and so on, it wouldn't be your character. It would only be your character if that was your action. So we'd have to know your action before we could dream of knowing your character. So you have to start with action. So it has to be in order. Action, and then what kind of character could perform this action? And then what does it mean? That's the three things. And then you simply divide up. What is going to give you the action? It can't simply be a synopsis. So you develop the idea of the plot theme, the essence of the action, which then leads you to, well, how was it structured? That's my first two. Then the characters are read off from that, which are essential and what their motivations must be, given the action. And then meaning. But meaning we do in two stages. The direct, explicit meaning given in the text, and then the wider framework, which we have to infer from that. So it seems to me inexorably logical to follow the structure that I'm following.
Thank you.
Do you have a problem with it?
No.
Okay. All right, let's take a couple more questions. Are you somebody new?
Yes.
Okay.
When you said that Ayn Rand was the only person since Shakespeare to understand hatred of the good for being the good, two exceptions came to my mind. And I guess I don't have a question, I just wonder if you'd agree with him. One is Nietzsche in regard to the Antichrist. He was more focused on Christianity than the essential hatred of the good for being the good. And then the other one is Nurse Ratched in the book and the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who just like hits the nail on the head.
Well, I didn't see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but I would be very surprised if that character had the profundity that you suggest. An undeviating hatred can just be an example of modern neurosis. It doesn't have to have the depth of being hatred of the good for being the good. Now, Nietzsche in The Antichrist, you make more of an example, but it's so tied in to one religion and one narrow view of the good that Nietzsche certainly has the brains for it. Whether his formulations stand up, I haven't reviewed them in that context. I would tend to think you have to read a lot into it. You know, it's like Aristotle. You can find everything in Aristotle if you read Ayn Rand first. And then you look back, everything, including omission of measurements, as the means of concept formation is in Aristotle. It's in one of his biological works, but it just happened that for 2,500 years nobody noticed it. Now they find it. Now, I did not mean, however, to make a big point of that. I have not got the knowledge to begin to defend as an objective proposition. Shakespeare and Ayn Rand are the only two that ever grasped this psychology. That would be a fantastic sweeping statement that I'm just not equipped to make. I say in my limited knowledge, those are the only two pure cases I have ever seen. One who created the character with the utter perfection of self-consciousness, and one who described the philosophic meaning. If there are others, and I mean it's been a type that's been around forever, more power to them. All right, let's take one final question. Okay, go. Is this like an upbeat question for a tragedy? Okay.
This question concerns two conflicting theories about the seeming causes of the downfall of Shakespeare's tragic heroes. One of the most common theory that has been formulated is the notion of the tragic flaw, such as greed, ambition, and jealousy.
Such as?
Greed, ambition, jealousy,
yeah.
and so on as the primary cause of their downfall.
Mm-hmm.
The other is a more recent theory, and that view is that the cause that covers all of their downfalls can be reduced to the notion of the limitation of human knowledge, and that is what they felt Shakespeare really was trying to imply.
Do you want to say something to make the second plausible?
That meant, okay, it was the view that when you take individual cases like Macbeth is misguided by the witches, Hamlet cannot decide because he never has enough knowledge to make a decision.
But what is Iago's
Othello
limitation of knowledge?
Iago's limitation of knowledge. I don't think Iago is considered I mean, I have to say,
Oh, you mean the
changed
thing
my
about
mind today.
Othello is he just doesn't know what Iago's up to.
No, he's misled if he could know the truth. The fact is that he cannot know the truth because he's only given a
to
biased
make
view of
short
the
work of that, I don't attach any validity whatever to that. That is so broad. You cannot make a tragedy out of a fact of human nature. That is exactly tantamount to saying man can't flap his wings and fly to the moon. And that's why all Shakespeare's tragedies end in suffering. You cannot remember, art is selective. You are rewriting, picking out what you think is the essence of man's life. If it's the fact that he's a living being who has to acquire knowledge by his own choice, and who therefore only has a limited amount at each step, if that is what defeats him, then it's not that. Because something else must be motivating you. No one in his right mind could come to this conclusion. Man's knowledge is limited. Therefore, there's no chance for him except destruction and doom. That will be exactly like saying, you have to open your eyes before you cross Fifth Avenue. Therefore, you can't get across. You know, because what if you walk into a truck that's coming? You're not all powerful. Obviously, accidents and a lack of knowledge can contribute. But in all Shakespeare's plays, the characters are not motivated by the desire for knowledge. The reverse is true. The characters are indifferent and hostile to knowledge, which is, you couldn't get through to them if you beat them over the head with it. Othello doesn't walk around saying, God, if only I knew the objective truth. He'll grab at anything that Iago says and says, that's it. He's become demonic. The whole thing is he's indifferent to knowledge and to the limitation of knowledge. Iago, of course, couldn't care less. Desdemona doesn't care less. She regards her virtue as being true or false, she's no good. If you said to her, your self-analysis is going to depend, on the objective knowledge, she said, what are you talking about? I'm no good no matter what. That's what my Christianity lies in. Every one of these characters is oblivious to knowledge. If you sat them down and they heard this whole lecture, they would still go on about their business. Iago would explain that it's all, part of his scheme on Cassio's part to confuse Othello, and Desdemona would say, he's selfish, don't listen to him. I mean, I don't agree with that theory. All right, on that note, we will start on Thursday with Lassie. Thanks.